1.200.000 storie.
1,200,000 stories. Many stories, as many as there were Italians, both men and women, used as labour in the war economy of Nazi Germany. At least 5 to 6 million people were involved, if we count their families, fathers and mothers, wives, sisters, brothers and children. At the time, just over 41 million people lived in Italy. This means that over 10% of Italian citizens were directly involved in these events. When did all this take place? Over the course of 7 years between 1938 and 1945. 1,200,000 stories comprising a single story, the story of the relationship between fascist Italy and National Socialist Germany, between the first form of fascism in history, emerging south of the Alps after the Great War, and its copy, much more radical and destructive, which rose to power in Berlin after the 1929 crisis. But it is also the story of the complicated relationship between their leaders, Benito Mussolini, and the man who always considered him a great mentor, Adolf Hitler. It was an extremely complex story, which at a certain point was affected by a radical change of scenario following the dramatic crisis of the summer of 1943 and the clumsy attempt of the traditional elites to withdraw from the international conflict. But it was too late. After the Anglo-American landing in Sicily, July-August of 1943, and the armistice of the 8th of September 1943, the war was being fought on Italian soil. Until the summer of 1943, Monaco-fascist Italy, the first partner of National Socialist Germany and signatory with Germany of the so-called Axis Agreements, 1936, and the Pact of Steel, 1939, as well as of the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Japan, 1940, provided its more industrialized and developed German ally with the manpower it needed, thus also solving the problem of unemployment afflicting the semi-industrialized Italian peninsula. For the Germans, workers from Italy, an allied country, could be employed in strategically important sectors where prisoners of war from countries occupied by Germany since 1939 could not be used for security reasons. Since Nazi Germany had taken over Austria in 1938, Italy and Germany found themselves sharing the border of the Brenner Pass. In the first 5 years, the movement of Italian forces beyond the Brenner Pass was regulated as part of the bilateral economic collaboration treaties between Berlin and Rome, whose economies became intertwined also on a currency level from 1934 onwards. Those who emigrated were farm labourers, including many women, construction workers, including those who built the Volkswagen factory and the city that grew up around it, Wolfsburg, and industrial workers, but also railway workers and waiters. It was not easy for the fascist regime to justify the resumption of emigration abroad after it had spent years denigrating liberal Italy and its encouragement of migration abroad, while the fascists claimed they had provided work and well-being for everyone. Mussolini's regime thus needed to sell the resumption of departures as an expression of solidarity, to be seen within the context of the Rome-Berlin axis and alliance. Fascist and Nazi newspapers, subservient to the regimes, defined these workers not as emigrants, but as soldiers of work. The organised emigration of industrial workers peaked in 1940 and 1941 as Berlin sought to tackle the shortfall of manpower in factories created in spring 1941 by mobilization in view of the attack on the Soviet Union, which would begin in June 1941. German decision-makers thought that the best option was to turn to Italy, an Allied state which had failed to prove its military worth, and to organize its economy efficiently for the ongoing war. Requests were thus made to Rome for 250,000 specialized workers. In an attempt to find such a large amount of manpower, Mussolini's government introduced a semi-coercive form of recruitment requiring each company to make a percentage of its employees available. Thanks to the intertwining of the two economies and the centralized management of foreign trade and currency flows, in this first phase, emigrants to Germany could send money home. Given that the workers transferred from Italy to the Reich totaled 500,000, this meant that thousands of Italian families lived wholly or partly on the money that periodically arrived from Germany. The cash remittances, which passed through banking circuits, were substantial, also because German wages in all sectors were 2 or 3 times higher than Italian wages. The second phase, which occupied the last 2 years of the war, 1943 to 1945, would be very different. After the 8th of September 1943, central northern Italy was occupied, and Hitler decided to resurrect Italian fascism, still led by Benito Mussolini, who on the 23rd of September 1943 established the Italian Social Republic, a puppet state under strict German control. But as the war dragged on, Nazi Germany continued to be hungry for manpower. In addition to detaining within its borders at least 100,000 of the Italian workers who had arrived there before the crisis of summer 1943, Berlin hastened to use as labour the great majority of the disarmed Italian soldiers taken prisoner by the Wehrmacht on the 8th of September 1943 and in the days immediately following. Defined by the German authorities not as prisoners of war, but as Italian military internees, IMI, and therefore exempt from the protection of the Geneva Red Cross, they numbered 650,000 in total. Soldiers and non-commissioned officers were immediately put to work, while for officers it took longer. Then, in August 1944, all IMIs were officially and forcibly reassigned as civilian workers. Furthermore, after the 8th of September 1943, the doors of the Konzentrationslager KRT, the Nazi concentration camps, also opened for Italians, with 23,826 deportees ending up there for political reasons, and 8,709 deported because they were Jews. The former were mainly sent to the KL of Dachau and Mauthausen. The latter almost all ended up in the concentration camp, extermination camp, of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Since 1942, the network of concentration camps had also been subservient to war production, and this involved both political deportees and, albeit in a different and much more terrible context, those Jews sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau who were not killed immediately after their arrival in the concentration and extermination camp located in Silesia. This was the fate of Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel. Obviously, the living and working conditions of political deportees and Jews used as slave labourers were very different, and much worse than those of civilian workers and prisoners of war, including IMIs, employed in production. The hunger for manpower on the part of the German bodies responsible for managing the war economy, among which the Ministry of Arms and Ammunition, led by Albert Speer, stood out, did not abate. The westwards shift of the Eastern Front after the Battle of Kursk in July-August 1943, at the same time as Operation Husky, that is, the Anglo-American landing in Sicily, which plunged the Italian monarcho-fascist regime into crisis, made it more difficult for the Germans to forcibly remove workers, especially women, from the vast occupied areas of the USSR, and Allied occupied Italy ended up being almost the last place where roundups could be carried out. Both in the two areas on the eastern border called operations zones by the German occupiers, Adriatic coast and Prealps, and by their directly administered bodies, and in the provinces formerly governed by Mussolini and his reconstituted fascist party, the recruitment of forces using increasingly brutal methods resumed. This included roundups and dragnets by both the Germans, the Wehrmacht and police departments, and the fascist Republicans, the various collaborationist militias that had emerged in the RSI. These operations combined the need to control the territory, the desire of the Nazis and the RSI to fight partisan insurgencies, and the need to find manpower at all costs, mainly to be sent beyond the Brenner Pass, but also to be used locally to build fortifications, such as the Gothic Line. With the connivance of the RSI's executive bodies, prisoners of all categories were taken from prisons and transferred to Germany, where they were used almost entirely in the chemical sector, with a very high mortality rate, comparable to that of political deportees in KL. The chemical plants where petrol and rubber were obtained from coal, of which Germany had abundant resources, allowed the Nazi leadership to survive the complete lack of oil and rubber until the spring of 1945. Why was Italian labour so important for the German war economy? It was important in two phases and for different reasons. In the first phase, in 1938-1942, because Italy was Germany's main ally, and therefore its workers were considered usable in all productions of a military nature, unlike prisoners of war or civilians conscripted in the occupied territories. While in 1942, given the prolongation of the war after the Battle of Moscow, September-December 1941, the Nazi leadership decided to make use of the manpower forcibly enlisted in the occupied areas of the USSR, and with the support of the collaborationist Vichy government in defeated and occupied France, Italy regained importance in late 1943 as a territory from which to take male and female workers, a further 100,000 as it turned out. As we said at the beginning, one story, many different stories, often extremely diverse. But almost 80 years after the end of the Second World War, these are stories, human events, and faces which all deserve to be remembered.